Nobody on the cattle drive wanted Remedios Salinas along, and they let her know it from the first moment with the same quiet cruelty that people use when they believe the right is on their side. If you believe that the silence of those who know can outlast the mockery of those who don't, subscribe to Tales from the Old Field and ring the bell so you never miss a story. The story happened in the foothills of the Durango Sierra, in one of those Augusts that lie, midday sun and cold hiding underneath the afternoon, where the north wind comes down licking the ravines and reaches the camps before anyone has lifted their eyes to look for it. Remedios Salinas was 43 years old when Don Aurelio Valenzuela organized the cattle drive of 200 head toward Parral, and she had spent 2 of those years as a widow after Isidro Salinas was crushed by a poorly roped bull on the Valenzuela property. She didn't inherit land or cattle. She inherited his patched blanket, his tools, his memory, and the trade of field cook that her late father-in-law had passed to her before age took him, the way real things are passed, without wills or papers, hand to hand and voice to voice. When the foreman Genaro Fuentes went out to find a cook for the drive, nobody wanted the work, because the route crossed the Sierra in the worst time of year, and the weather up there was unpredictable as an unbroken colt. Remedios showed up at first light on Monday with her pack on her shoulder, her griddle rolled in rope, and Isidro's flint striker wrapped in a scrap of cotton cloth at the bottom of the pack, where she had kept it since the day of the burial, because it was what had lasted longest of the man she had loved most. Genaro Fuentes looked her up and down with the expression that certain men wear when they calculate the weight of something and decide before they've finished looking that it weighs too little. He didn't say yes with pleasure or no with honesty. He said yes because she was the only one who had accepted the wage he was offering, and because he no longer had time to look for anyone else. And he said it out loud, turned toward the yard, so his cowboys could hear. The cowboys listened and said nothing in that moment. But Remedios heard what they murmured among themselves when she was already walking toward the first pack mule to tie her gear. What was the point of sending a widow out into the open field? And whether she planned to pray the rosary over the coals and call a miracle whatever came out of it. That morning, while the drive set itself in motion, raising a cloud of road dust that took half an hour to settle on the gravel track, Remedios walked behind the last pack mule with her patched blanket crossed over her shoulders and the clay cup tapping softly against her hip inside the pack. She didn't turn her head. She closed her eyes just once, the way people do when they're praying something that has no words. And she opened them, and she put one foot in front of the other, with the same quiet steadiness she had learned to move with since Isidro was gone. Slowly, but without stopping. The first night they camped at the edge of the gravel road, where the mesquites still offered a little cover, and the ground was flat, and the pack animals could rest without slipping. Remedios had the fire going before any of the cowboys had taken the saddle off his horse, heated the beans from the pot she had prepared the night before, made fresh tortillas on the griddle with the cornmeal she carried in the pack, and set the clay pot coffee to boil with cinnamon and brown sugar. The smell of the coffee and the warm dough spread through the camp the way the light of late afternoon spreads, without asking permission and without anyone ordering it. The 12 cowboys ate without thanking her, with the gesture of people collecting something that is theirs by right. One of them, a lanky young man named Bracamontes, said with his mouth still full, and without looking at his hands, that his grandmother cooked just as bland, and that was why everyone on his ranch was skinny. Nobody laughed, but nobody corrected him either, and that silence was its own kind of permission. Remedios collected the dishes, washed the griddle with sand and a cloth scrap, put the clay cup at the bottom of the pack, and spread Isidro's patched blanket on the ground to sleep. From where she lay, she could see the line of fires the cowboys had lit at the other end of the camp, larger and louder than hers, and she thought that fire has never known whom it belongs to or who needs it. It only knows how to burn, and it burns for whoever knows how to ask it. 3 days passed that way, the drive advancing slowly through the canyon toward the heart of the Durango Sierra, and the treatment was always the same. She cooked before dawn, served at midday, cleaned up at night. The cowboys ate. Genaro Fuentes gave her the exact attention that a foreman gives to a hand who does the work without complaining, which is the same attention given to the griddle and the rope. Enough to make it last. No more. And the cowboys alternated between ignoring her and making comments that she let fall to the ground like stones that have nowhere to bounce. On the morning after the third day, Remedios was kneading before daybreak, as she always did, with hands that already knew the way without her eyes needing to guide them. She made a double pot of coffee, because the night had come down colder than expected, and the animals had woken with their coats standing on end. While she stirred the clay cup over the small fire, she thought of Isidro, who had also loved coffee in the before-dawn dark, who used to say that coffee in the darkness tastes different from coffee in the daylight, because the body isn't fully awake yet, and what enters it is received with more honesty. She swallowed slowly, then kept stirring. What none of the cowboys knew yet was what Remedios was carrying in that cotton cloth folded at the bottom of the pack. The flint striker had belonged to Don Porfirio Salinas, Remedios' father-in-law, who had worked nearly 40 years as a packer in the mountains of Durango and Chihuahua, in a time when there were no gravel roads or marked trails, and no way of knowing when the bad weather was going to catch you. Don Porfirio used to say that in the Sierra 2 things kill a careless man: thirst and cold. Thirst you solve by keeping an eye on the streams and having the patience to find them. Cold you solve with fire, but fire in the Sierra doesn't start the way it does in the courtyard at home. The damp, the wind, the wood that isn't always dry, all of it conspires against the flame when you need it most. That was why Don Porfirio had taught Isidro the technique he himself had learned from an old packer, whose name was no longer known, but whose hand was still present in the flint striker that passed from generation to generation the way real trades pass, without ceremony and without being forgotten. Isidro had taught Remedios on their wedding night, both of them sitting on the corridor of the adobe house, with the fire out and the sky full of stars. It wasn't romantic, and it wasn't strange. It was as natural as teaching someone you love to swim if you live near the river, or to milk if you have cows. He had told her, whoever shares their life with a man of the land must know what a man of the land knows, because the land does not distinguish between men and women when the weather turns fierce. Remedios had learned everything Isidro taught her that night. And when Isidro died, she put the flint striker in the pack with the kitchen things, beside the griddle and the clay cup, because that was where Isidro would have put it. The rest of the world would understand that much later. On the 4th day of travel, the sky changed color before noon, and Remedios saw it before any of the 12 cowboys lifted their eyes from the road. It was a violet band coming in from the west above the junipers, too low and too compact to be ordinary rain clouds, with an edge that moved quickly and without the disorder of normal clouds. She recognized that violet because Isidro had described it to her exactly that way. That color isn't rain, Remedios. It's a blizzard. And in the Durango Sierra, an August blizzard can arrive in 2 hours and last 2 days, and can drop the temperature to levels that a body without shelter and without fire cannot endure without trouble. She said nothing at first. She finished kneading the dough she had in her hands, set it on the griddle with the patience of someone who knows that fear saves no time and solves nothing, and went to find Genaro Fuentes to show him the horizon without adding more words than the sky was already saying for her. Genaro looked at the horizon. He looked at his cowboys. He looked at the horizon again, hoping the second time the sky would be different. It wasn't different. There was no cabin or shelter within 4 hours' travel in the direction they were headed. But Remedios remembered that Isidro had once spoken to her of an old shelter beside a dry spring, half a league up through the woods, behind a rock formation that from a distance looked like a man sleeping on his side. He had called it the Juniper Cabin because there was a 100-year-old juniper beside it whose roots gripped the earth from before anyone in that territory had a name. She had never seen it with her own eyes, but she carried it in her memory with the precision that the stories told by those we love carry themselves, stored with more faithfulness than the things we read or the things we lived through alone. She told Gennaro, who looked at her with the same expression as the first day. Then the north wind came through the canyon smelling of ice, in a way that left no room for argument, and Gennaro told her to lead on. They climbed through the woods in a line, the cattle first, because animals carry in their bodies a knowledge that men have been slowly losing, and Remedios at the front, guiding them with her patched blanket over her shoulders and the pack crossed over her chest. She walked recalling Isidro's words about the rock formation that looked like a sleeping man, searching with her eyes for the profile he had once drawn for her in the air with one finger on a night many years before. The blizzard caught them an hour into the climb. The wind came first, bending the shrubs and lifting Bracamontes' hat and rolling it down the hillside, and then the cold came in behind the wind, dry and direct, without warning. In 10 minutes, the temperature dropped enough that the youngest cowboys began shivering inside their jackets, and the horses began blowing steam from their nostrils. And then, Remedios saw something that made her release the breath she had been holding since the wind arrived. Remedios saw the rock formation. It was exactly as Isidro had described it, a gray stone shape that from a certain angle took the form of a man seen from behind, his head tilted toward his chest, as if he were sleeping, sitting up. And behind it, among the junipers growing tight against the stone, was the rusted tin roof of the cabin. And beside the cabin, the 100-year-old juniper with its roots twisted like fingers that refused to let go. They drove the cattle into the roofed pen behind the cabin, and the 12 cowboys and Gennaro Fuentes pushed inside through the door that didn't close properly, because the wood had warped over the years. Inside it was small and smelled of wet earth and old wood. But it had walls, it had a roof, and in the most sheltered corner was a stone brazier that some previous packer had built with enough skill to last generations. Bracamontes was the first to try to light the brazier. He had wooden matches in the pocket of his vest and used them one by one. 3, 4, 7 matches, while the wind slipped through the warped door and snuffed the flame before it could catch. Bracamontes made a sound that wasn't exactly a laugh, but wasn't silence either when the 7th match went out. Toribio, the oldest cowboy in the group, tried next with the technique he said he'd learned from his father, stacking the wood like a tower and lighting from the bottom. The cabin's firewood was damp from dew and years of disuse. It didn't catch. They tried with a sheet of paper someone had in his saddlebag. The paper burned without lighting the wood. They tried with dry grass gathered from the farthest corner from the door. The wind put it out before it had time to grow. The cabin filled with smoke without heat, which is the worst combination when the body is already at its limit and the shivering won't stop. Gennaro Fuentes stood in the middle of the cabin with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw set, staring at the dead brazier as if willpower could light it. And then, without saying anything, his gaze traveled the room and came to rest on where Remedios was standing near the door, with the pack still crossed over her shoulder. And then Remedios set the pack on the floor of the entrance, unfolded the cotton cloth, and took out Isidro's flint striker. Nobody said a word. She knelt in front of the brazier with the same calm she knelt before any fire on any dawn of any drive, without hurry and without fear, because panic is a luxury that serves no purpose for lighting anything. She took the thinnest wood from the pile, the pieces the cowboys had passed over because they seemed too small to be useful, and arranged them in the center of the brazier, following the order that Don Porfirio had taught Isidro, and that Isidro had taught her. First the heart of the finest slivers in the center, then the nest of agave fiber that she always carried in the kitchen pack, because Isidro had told her once, only once, never to travel without it, and then the patched blanket spread on the floor, forming a screen between the door and the brazier to cut the wind seeping through the gap. She struck the flint striker once, a spark. The agave fiber didn't catch. Bracamontes made that sound again, the one that wasn't a laugh but wasn't silence, and Toribio put a hand on his shoulder to quiet him. Remedios didn't lift her eyes. She remembered what Isidro had corrected her on the third time she practiced it, not top to bottom, but diagonal, grazing the flint with the steel at the exact point where the stone still had a live edge. She adjusted her hand. She struck the flint striker a second time. The spark fell directly onto the nest of agave fiber. The fiber caught with a small blue flame that lasted the time a breath lasts. Remedios blew toward it with her mouth nearly closed, slowly, with the patience that comes from knowing that fire does not hurry even when you are cold. The small flame found the thin slivers. The thin slivers found the medium branches, and in less time than any of those men would have believed possible that night, the stone brazier of the 100-year-old juniper was burning with a steadiness that was not going to go out until Remedios decided it was time to put it out. The warmth spread through the cabin the way mercy spreads, slowly at first, without announcing itself, but with no reverse. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Remedios lifted the patched blanket from the floor, shook it, folded it over her knees, and went to the pack for the clay cup. That night she made pot coffee over the brazier, with the water from the canteen and the brown sugar she always carried. And the smell of the coffee filled the cabin with a warmth that was not only temperature, but something older and more necessary than simple heat. The cowboys sat around the brazier with their hands stretched toward the flames, and nobody made any comment about the flavor or about anything. Genaro Fuentes received the first clay cup that Remedios held out to him with both hands, and he held it that way, warming his palms, for a long moment before bringing it to his lips. The blizzard beat against the tin roof all that night with the sound of a hand that won't stop knocking. Remedios kept the fire going with the same calm movements as always, adding wood at the exact moment before the flame dropped, adjusting the position of the coals when the wind shifted, making the heat last with the same care that whoever knows how much bread there is to share uses to make it last. Before dawn she made corn porridge with the maize she carried in the pack, and the cowboys drank it from the clay cup in turns, in silence, with the humility that cold gives a man when he realizes he knows less than he thought. What none of them had said in 4 days, the silence of that night said for them. That there are kinds of knowledge that pass from hand to hand the way patched blankets pass, from those who knew to those who wanted to learn, and that the one who mocked the weight of someone has never had to depend on that weight in the moment when it matters most. Bracamontes was the first to speak. He did it without lifting his eyes from the brazier, in the low voice a young man uses when something that should have been simple from the beginning costs him something to say. "Señora Salinas," he said, "I'm sorry about the first day." Remedios looked at him, then looked at the fire, then looked back at him with the calm expression of someone who doesn't need what's being offered, but doesn't refuse what's given without calculation. "I didn't come here to be apologized to, Bracamontes," she said in a firm voice without raising it. "I came here to be paid what I'm worth." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 12 men learning something nobody had ever taught them with words. Toribio, the eldest of the group, asked that night where she had learned to start a fire in those conditions, with wood that wet and wind from across like that. My husband taught me, said Remedios, without taking her eyes from the cup she held between her palms. And his father taught him before that. And so on. Toribio nodded slowly, the way old men nod when they hear something they recognize, even though they haven't seen it before. That's not taught anymore, he said. Well, there you are, Remedios answered. That's what widows are for. At daybreak the following morning, when the wind finally eased and the sky began opening toward the east with the pale sun that follows a blizzard, Remedios was the first one up. She put out the brazier with the method Don Porfirio had taught Isidro, covering the coals with dry ash so the fire would sleep clean and not leave dangerous embers for whoever came next. Then she gathered her patched blanket, folded it carefully over her knees, and put the flint striker back in the cotton cloth. She settled the clay cup in the pack beside the griddle. She lifted the pack onto her shoulder and went out to see how the animals were. The cattle were all there. The horses had endured the cold without losses. The 100-year-old juniper still gripped the earth with its twisted roots as if the blizzard had been nothing new for it. Genaro Fuentes came out behind Remedios and stood on the cabin's narrow porch looking at the clean sky. Then he looked at Remedios. Then looked at the sky again. You told me you could cook, he said. Yes, Remedios answered. You didn't tell me the rest. You didn't ask, she said. Genaro Fuentes didn't answer. He took 3 coins from the pocket of his vest and placed them in the palm of Remedios's hand without saying anything more, and she received them without saying anything either, because between people who already understand each other, words are sometimes surplus. When the winter rains came the following season, the drive arrived at Parral with the cattle complete and well fed, because animals that ride out a blizzard well sheltered arrive stronger than those that walk too far in the cold. Genaro Fuentes paid everyone the agreed amount, and to Remedios he gave the agreed amount plus what she had already earned in the juniper cabin. And Bracamontes, the lanky one who had never known when to keep quiet, carried her pack to the first pack mule without anyone asking him to, and without saying a word, which was his way of saying everything. Remedios went back to her adobe house on the outskirts of the town, carrying Isidro's patched blanket over her shoulders, with the clay cup in the pack, and the flint striker wrapped in the cotton cloth. She set the striker on the sleeping mat where Isidro's pillow used to be, which was where it belonged, and she stayed a moment looking at it before making the afternoon coffee. They say in the Durango Sierra that even today, when someone on a cattle drive underestimates the camp cook, one of the old men raises his hand and says, "Remember the widow of the juniper cabin." And they know the story by heart even though they weren't there, because there are stories that survive the cold the same way fire survives when someone who knew how lit it when nobody else could. Sometimes the most desperate moments don't arrive to destroy us, but to reveal what we were already carrying, what we learned with love and kept without knowing when it was going to be needed. Remedios Salinas didn't save 12 men because she was braver or stronger. She saved them because she had learned from those who loved her, and she had kept that learning with the same care she kept Isidro's patched blanket, not knowing the day she would need it, but never letting it go. Have you ever had someone believe in you just when you were starting to doubt your own worth? If this story touched something in your heart, leave us your comment down below. Tell us what part of Mexico you're watching from, or wherever you are in the world today. Subscribe to Tales from the Old Field and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that what we learn with love is never forgotten when it's needed most. We have another story waiting for you. A hug from heart to heart. And remember, Never underestimate the one who carries in silence what others didn't know how to keep. Bracamonte said it years later, when he was old and had grandchildren who asked him why every time the north wind arrived he made coffee even when he wasn't cold. "I learned it from a woman who knew things I believed were worth nothing," he said, "and she taught them to me without saying a single word about what I had said about her."